An area of growing interest in the past 5 years or so has been gender confusion or gender dysphoria amongst autistic people. There is research saying that it is more common. So there are two studies, one putting the rate at about 7.8% and one at about 5.5%, where they've looked at people turning up for a gender identity clinic and how many of those met the criteria to be on the autistic spectrum. That is a much higher rate than the general population. And again, recently I've seen another study that's kind of saying, no, it's the same rate. The difficulty is it might present slightly differently. So this is producing a difficulty, if you like, for gender identity services. Because going back to what I was talking about, if you can't access your own feelings, you can't explain necessarily how you feel different or why you would want to be female or male, the other gender, the alternative gender.
In your talk, you talk about the higher rates of gender dysphoria among individuals on the spectrum. And I wondered why you think that is.
Okay, well, I think it's an interesting question. I think in my personal view, and there's nothing in particular that backs this up, I think if you think about the whole issue of sexuality being a spectrum, that we're all on it somewhere, we tend to pigeonhole people into boxes, like I said, but that's a social construction. Gender in itself in that type is a socially constructed thing. So if you are someone who doesn't particularly get or clue into or take notice of, if you like, the social rules, then you're going to be less likely to try and put yourself into one category or another, to say, well, I'm homosexual or heterosexual, or I'm bisexual, or I'm female, or I'm male. So I think, my view is, I think people on the spectrum are probably more honest about their sexuality. I think they are more willing to say, actually, no, I'm not going to conform, or I don't conform to one of these ways of being, if you like.
Can I just ask, that sounds like you're talking about the individuals who are more fluid with their sexuality or their clothing or their gender identity. But I suppose I'm wondering more about those who identify as male, who are born female, or whether they're kind of two different.
So again, I think So I think what I'm trying to say is that people are less socially constrained to keep to one gender when maybe they might feel they're a particularly feminine male or they're a particularly male female. Maybe if they, I don't know, maybe if it was somebody who was more constrained socially, they might continue to put themselves in that, to present themselves as just traditionally male or just traditionally female. So perhaps they feel more free to come forwards and to say, actually, I don't fit my biological gender, it doesn't feel right. Equally, I think for gender services, there is then an issue around, and I'm not saying it isn't I'm not saying it isn't genuine gender dysphoria, but actually trying to just be aware for this client group, they may be looking for an explanation of difference. And if as you've grown up, you've not felt you fit with your own gender group, so I'm a girl, but I don't like wearing girls' clothes, they're uncomfortable, I'm a bit of a tomboy, I prefer to hang out with boys. And if you think of in-group and out-group psychology, so a group of girls are less likely to accept a girl who's different, a group of boys are less likely to accept a boy who's different, but the opposite group are more willing to take them in. A group of little girls might mother a boy who's different, and so he might identify as being with that group. Same for the boys, who'll accept a tomboy, she wants to come and play with us. So it might be that in looking for a reason for why you don't fit, why you feel different, and why you're perhaps a bit more open-minded, undecided, if you like, around your gender or how you fit, you might come to the conclusion that that must be it. It must be that really I'm a boy or really I'm a girl, I'm a different gender to my biological gender. It's a possibility. It's something I think that services need to be aware of, just so that, because once you go down the route, it's not an easy route to go down. You start taking hormones, you start taking hormone blockers, then you start taking hormones for the opposite sex, HRT and things. It's a hard route to go down if that's not genuinely what the issue is. So it's just being aware of that.
I really like your approach that actually with this honesty comes an acknowledgement of perhaps more flexibility or fluidity than maybe lots of other people are willing to articulate.
Yeah, and some, there's a higher rate of asexuality amongst autism. Some people I've seen don't particularly want to pursue, in the end, being one gender or the other, and are perfectly happy to sit somewhere in the middle, if you like, with aspects of both. And some people, on further talking and further thinking about it and exploring it from an autism context, will kind of come back and say, do you know, I'm just not really interested in anything. I don't want to be either. That's fine too. Yeah, it's that kind of acceptance of any range anywhere along the scale, isn't it?
And I think you mentioned earlier the fact that some of the people that we support or know may choose to go out in attire that maybe with that freedom comes some vulnerability or some. Do you find yourself in the position where you're having to sort of feed back or suggest maybe that's too risque for the high street or near a school? Or is that how would you?
Well, again, if you think around, and I'm not making a sweeping statement here, but a lot of people on the spectrum, or some people on the spectrum as well as some people not, having issues around theory of mind, so understanding how they appear to somebody else. Yeah, I've had a client who wants to walk down the high street in a tutu and trying to say, so what might other people think? Oh, nothing, you know. So actually trying to get someone to understand that in terms of how other people see that, they're making themselves vulnerable. It's not that it's wrong, it's just that you're putting yourself in a position where, you know, 12 o'clock, 11 o'clock on a Saturday night, when the pubs turn out, you might be a lot more vulnerable than somebody who's dressed more traditionally, shall we say.
So your role is just kind of compensating for that?
Well, it's understanding, yes, it's, again, a lot of this, it's education. It's if you like, if necessary, it's coming to a point where it might be rules, that it's not like it, you know, it's not a good idea to do this, it's not a good idea to do that. It might be just education around walking around in another person. It was transitioning male to female, but before any kind of medication or anything, so still looking very much like a male in a miniskirt and a crop top in town at 1 a.m, you know, it's actually helping people with their appearance. So things like workshops around hair, workshops around makeup, workshops around dressing. So in Oxfordshire, we're very fortunate, we have a dating group, Mates and Dates, that people are aware of, but it has also an offshoot that's an LGBT group, Mingle. So they would run things like workshops around makeup and around hair and how to present yourself, how to dress, and that made a massive difference to this particular client, going along to that. So it's education again. It's not taking for granted that somebody would know those things, would necessarily pick up how it's okay. I don't like to say okay to look, but that they might look. To be safe. Yeah.
But again, it's coming back to challenging the idea that if you shy away from talking about it, it won't happen. That
people are more at risk.
Yeah, it's having those conversations.
Yeah, because you're leaving people to make assumptions, and they might not make the best ones. Most gender identity services, you have to undergo up to a year of counselling to talk about why you want to do this and your feelings around it and how it's expressing itself for you. That might be really hard for somebody on the spectrum. So they may well then be seen as, well, this isn't really a gender identity issue because they can't talk about it. I've had a couple of clients, one young man for whom that was very much the case. He couldn't access those emotions and talk about it or explain himself, and so was discharged by services. I think in the long run that was probably right, because I think his was actually more of a fetish than a genuine gender confusion, if you like. So it might present slightly differently in autism than it could do in somebody else. It might be that there's a confusion of actually a young man wanting to have a girlfriend with being a girl. This young man I'm talking of, there was very much that confusion. Sometimes he'd say, well, I want to be a girl. Sometimes he'd say, no, I want to have a girlfriend. And when you ask, well, what is it about having a girlfriend? Well, I want to go in on Monday and say that I've been to the restaurant and I've been to the cinema with my girlfriend like everybody else does. So that was more about social conformity and wanting to be able to do the same things as everybody else. But he was confusing that then with wanting to actually be a girl himself.
Of some clients who were born girls and said they didn't feel like a girl, but I sometimes wonder whether that's I'm different.
When you then get to puberty, yes, I've also known that at that age, girls who then might start binding their breasts, who might shave off all hair on the body, or something called pubic hair, because it's doing all this and I never said it could, and now my body's betraying me, it's suddenly becoming different, and I don't want it to be different. So kind of an extension of that, you're quite right, starting to think, well, I must be a boy then, because I don't want all these things, I must be male in a female body. Now there will also be people who genuinely are male in a female body. And I'm not saying that that's true for everybody, but for me, it makes it much harder to tease out in autism. Is this genuine gender identity issue, or is this looking for an explanation for being different and not liking who you are and what's happening to you at the moment? And I think what's difficult, and it's probably politically incorrect of me to say it, but is that in gender identity services, people are taken at their word, and they almost daren't suggest that that's not real, if you like. And so there's a temptation then to kind of go, yep, that's great, hormone treatment, on we go. But actually, if that's not the issue, that can be quite risky. So vulnerabilities, poor theory of mind. So in this situation, so somebody who's dressing as the opposite gender, so particularly male to female, and not being particularly aware of how they look, so not necessarily doing it particularly well, and looking like a man badly dressed up as a woman, so then very vulnerable to other people. So I have known clients who would want to go out on the town dressed up like that, not aware that actually a lot of people after too much to drink might pick on them, and they might end up in quite a difficult situation. Unaware that other people actually not always wonderful and might victimise somebody who looks different, very, very, very different. So this issue of poor insight, so difficulty explaining why they want to do this and why they want to be like this. And equally, I certainly had one client who was aware that he could pay. There were ladies on the back page of the paper, and he could pay them to do some of the things he wanted. Now, the Sexual Offences Act means that none of us, parents or carers, can help him do that. So then he was hugely vulnerable because he had a job and he had an income and might well have been seen as easy pickings, if you like. And also some of the things he wanted people to do would have left him in a vulnerable position. So again, much more vulnerabilities there to being taken advantage of. And maybe not understanding what people might be asking for or what he might be asking for and how they might interpret that. Similarly, some of the clients with gender confusion issues or gender identity issues, there are places, societies, groups that people can go to, general public, anybody else might go to if they want to, but they're always group settings. So again, for people on the autistic spectrum, the thought of going to a group, I could find him places where he could go, this gentleman, to cross-dress with others or to try out being a woman amongst others. But his response was, why would I want to do that? I don't want to go and be around other people doing it. I want to do it myself. Interested in kind of more BDSM kind of thing. Again, it's mostly group settings where those things take place. You can go and join groups and take part in their activities, but that's a hugely social context again. So very difficult for people on the spectrum to access it. So obsessions I've talked about a bit. Fetishism. So the visual and tactile aspects of that are more common in autism. So you have a higher incidence of people with attraction to what they call partialism, so objects, parts of the body. So I've known a couple of gentlemen for whom it was feet, very sexually attracted to feet, which is a nightmare, because trying to say to support staff in the house, that's fine, you've all got to wear trainers all summer, no bare feet, and then you take him out to Tesco's and everyone's in flip-flops. So it's very difficult to manage. Less awareness, again, of what's not socially acceptable and what are the societal norms around that kind of area. And again, I mentioned earlier, greater incidence in arousal, sexual arousal by objects, all sorts of objects. I've known people, one gentleman, broom handles, don't ask me why, I don't know why, Wellington boots, all sorts of things that people have become sexually interested in. And again, if you think what I was saying about earlier, it's that kind of extension of an interest, but not towards a person. And it's just kind of, it may be that it's what happens to be their particular passion at the time or their obsessive interest at the time. So this might have been sensory interest originally. Wellington boots have a very rubbery feel to them. Or it might have been some special interest in childhood that's now extended into a sexual area. If you think about it, it's not that uncommon. It's just that most people don't talk about it. So actually out in society, if you read the papers, it seems to usually be politicians or something like that. But people who have unusual attractions tends to be a hidden thing. It's not something you sit down and talk about with the family at dinner. Oh, I did this last week, or I did this. For someone with autism, again, they may not get that. So I have worked with a gentleman who liked to tell his mum all about some very unusual sexual interests he had. And mum, understandably, found that very difficult and didn't want to know. So one of his rules in working with him is you don't talk to anybody except your psychologist about these kind of things. So that can make it very hard on the family. And actually, for the person getting access to the things that they want to get access to, so even just cross-dressing, getting female clothing, might be very difficult, because if you find it excruciatingly difficult to go into a shop and to ask somebody for something and to buy things, then you're going to need support to do that. That's something that is where support staff come in. Going back to a question earlier, it might be that you're helping somebody to access the things they need. People are therefore, again, quite vulnerable to exploitation. And again, a bit like earlier, that trying to genuinely work out, is this a fetish? A genuine fetish, or is it that this person doesn't have the skills and the knowledge and the ability to go and relate to people, and would they rather do that and learn how to do that, or try to do that, or have support to do that, or is it genuinely that they're just not interested in people and they're interested in objects?
So if someone you start teaching them the language, say like you give an example, go in the bathroom, that's a private area. Say if they are nonverbal, so for an example they are nonverbal, so how would you move on from there if they are going to look into relationships? Because you just taught them, go in the bathroom, that's a private area. So how do they move on from there?
So how do they move to, just to make sure I've understood it right, so understanding that those private behaviours, sexual behaviours you do in the bathroom, you can then do with another person if you're in a relationship? Yes. So I would say it's taking it a step at a time. So if somebody is not interested, if you like, if at the time or that period of their life they're just learning about masturbating in the bathroom, that's fine, you're giving them the rules around that. When it becomes apparent that somebody is interested in moving into a relationship, then I would be explaining to them, probably with pictures and drawings, that it's okay, you can do that with another person, but only if that person wants to do it. So you have to be very, very clear around consent, which I haven't really touched on this, that the other person wants to do this, and then that you are both doing it in a place that's private and not in front of other people. So then you need to bring in rules around where it's okay to do this. If somebody's non-verbal, there is another whole minefield that starts to open up. Not just if somebody's non-verbal, but understanding whether they have the capacity to consent to having sex with another person. Now, the Mental Capacity Act very kindly left that out, but there is plenty of precedent there now, and a good practice understanding of how you might assess that with somebody, to make sure that both parties are in agreement and are consenting to have a relationship. Interestingly, the cases that have gone through the courts, the bar is set quite low, and it's hard to work those things out for somebody who's non-verbal. Then your role might be in supporting that relationship to happen, in helping people to spend time with each other. But equally, there is a danger of assuming too much. So I have done that myself in the past, early days, made that mistake of starting to have conversations with somebody who was verbal but had probably a moderate learning disability and autism, and had a girlfriend, and staff had observed that they were spending time in the bedroom together and that some clothes were coming off. And so I made the assumption that he needed to know a lot more about how you had sex and about consent and that kind of thing. And clearly they were nowhere near that point or intending to go that far. And the poor gentleman was mortified and stopped the whole assessment, quite rightly. So that's why I say I'd be very clear that that's the direction the person's wanting to take it in before you then start to have those conversations with them. And then it's about actually how far do they want to go? Do they want to just hold hands? Do they want to just take it one step further? We often assume that people want to actually go as far as having sex together. They may not. So I think it requires a lot of sensitivity to work out what's going on. And if in doubt, I would say get advice. Refer to, usually psychology is quite, or nursing, or there are people out there who can help advise.